G'day everyone, for today's vlog we are going to be looking at the Oni, one of the antagonistic groups within Fragged Empire. So if you really want to learn about the Oni, the best book to look for that is one that's already out, Rachel Swagger's Guide to Mishpasha. So that is, not that one. Is this one here. Okay, so this is the book you want. So I've gone for a slightly different style of lore writing in this book, in that it's all written from the perspective of like a journal or a report from a character within the setting. So yeah, okay. So the Oni, let's do a bit of a quick rundown on them. So the Oni are a particular. Okay, so when I say the word Oni, there's two different ways we're going to look at it. Okay, so one is the actual species Oni, which is to describe a particular strain of Nephilim. Okay, so they were created to function during the war with a specific purpose. And they are just one type of Nephilim. But then there is the Oni brood, which is a particular antagonistic faction. Okay, so let's run through them, and we're gonna have a look at some artwork. So, got a few different, giant, big, four-armed brutes with a little bit of plated metal armor and giant cannons is generally how they go. And they've got lots of slaves and stuff that fight for them. So, okay. And one little thing. So this is a little glimpse of what I'm also working at. Is I'm having a quick figuring out the design for the different looks of the different spaceships from the different species. So this one up here, the right, is the Oni. So it's got a bit of a ramshackle sort of feel to it. Cool. Okay, so let's jump into it. Okay, so so what were the Oni made for? So Nephilim generally are created for a purpose, and so during the war, the Oni are actually sentient refineries. Okay, so their job during the war was to go around and eat things up. So they would eat corpses after a battle of whatever Nephilim and whatever they'd been killing, and then the Oni would poop out a type of refined biofuel. So that was their job. I mean, they were kind of biggish, but not ginormous at that stage. They weren't created to be frontline fighters. They were utility Nephilim. Okay, so how did these guys end up taking over and defining an entire brood? So a brood of a Nephilim was basically a group assigned under a arch-genocrat. And they were given the task of usually to attack a specific species during the Great Exion War. So the Devway Ich led a brood against the Kaltorans. And that brood eventually settled on the planet Eden and is now known as the Eden Brood. And that's the sort of the PC group of Nephilim. You generally come from that brood. But there were other broods all over the place, each with their own arch-genocrat leading them. So there was one particular brood off in a distant location, and we don't know exactly where. And their battle, their war, was not going super great. So I got the sense that they had effectively destroyed their enemy, but the enemy with their last Archons were locked up in sort of a final fortress. And this brood didn't really have the resources to get victory, to get this final victory. Because the number one objective of the war was to kill all of the Archons. Okay? And this brood had lost effectively nearly all of its fighters. Okay? And they, as a last ditched effort, this brood gathered together what forces they could, which included the Oni, and led a big attack against this last stronghold. And the battle went well enough in that the Nephilim won, and particularly the Oni were part of that group that sort of did that final victory up against the fortress, and right at the end. Okay, so we don't know if this is after the battle had won or right just before that final victory. The Exion itself turned up on this world. I kind of like to think that it got wind that it was its forces were going to lose there, and so it sort of turned up to make sure the job was finished. And the Exion has a bit of a nature of doing this, so it's not the first time it's done it. Anyway, so it turns up, and the Oni have just had a victory, and the Exion effectively said the equivalent of "good job." That's it. Nothing particularly fancy, nothing ostentatious. No big declarations. Did a good job, and I kind of assumed the Exion went off and then finished the job and killed the last Archons and then moved on. But the very simple-minded, brutish Oni took this as they are now the chosen ones. Okay? They took this as this big, grand, declaratory statement by the Exion, which is effectively the Nephilim god, that the Oni are like the supreme Nephilim. Okay? The Exion's true children. Okay. After this, the war ended, and lots of the Nephilim started to turn a bit feral, and this brood had already been devastated. We don't know whether its arch-genocrat had already been killed or something else. And out of desperation, the Nephilim that were left over turned on each other. And at this point is when the Oni became, you know, I like to imagine as they're driven by this sort of religious zealotry. They're banded together, and they took over the brood, effectively, by eating the other Nephilim. Okay? And this would probably be the end of the story, in that the Oni would probably just eat the other Nephilim, the Nephilim fight each other, and they turn a bit feral, and that's it. Nothing happens. But a ship from a lizard-like species, Archon created species, turned up. I've got the name in the book, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. And this ship was part of survivors, and anyway, the Oni took it. Killed the lizards, took their ship, and this ship they then used to travel back to that where those survivors were from, and killed them and ate them and enslaved them. Okay? And this effectively just out of luck, the Oni managed to become spaceborne. Okay? They got new resources and built more ships and things like that. And this was when a particularly a genetic quirk of the Oni started to become particularly important. See, the Oni never stop growing. They continuously get bigger and bigger, and presumably their genes don't degrade, and they just get older. And so by this time, some of these Oni are larger than an Oni has ever been before. So I kind of imagine, you know, you're starting to look at ones about this size now, okay? And this is when their culture starts to form a little bit more. They come sort of these looting, scavenging, pillaging, enslaving, might makes right sort of group with this big You're dominated by the bigger Oni are in charge, coupling that with sort of this religious zealotry of they are the chosen ones of the Exion. And a couple more things also happened during this time. So they've started to enslave some other survivors, like little dregs of different species, and they come across a group called the Tolatl. So that's these guys. So if you're familiar with Fragged Kingdom, you'll know of the Tolatl, these little goblinoids with a tail. And the thing about the Tolatl is that the Tolatl were designed to be Archon assistants and lab assistants, and they had this little quirk where they had a genetic kill switch if their genes were ever tampered with or contaminated. And I think this is to do with the Oni internal refinery system of their stomach, in that when they ate a Tolatl, it made them sick, because the Tolatl would basically disintegrate and poison the Oni, and then the Oni would throw up. And so they ended up with this group of enslaved people that they couldn't eat like the others. And the Tolatl, I think partially because they were also the servants, or I mean, they're effectively slaves of the Archons. Okay, we call them servants, but we know full well the Archons didn't give them any liberty. And since the Tolatl probably didn't know any existence besides sort of being a subservient species, they kind of slotted in to the Oni, and they learnt how to survive. Okay, they made themselves useful, and so they became sort of the taskmasters of the other slaves, the technicians. Okay, and I suspect the Tolatl, those early Tolatl, had access to a few little bits of Archon tech during that time, which gave the Archon which gave the Oni a bit of an edge in a couple of areas. So another quirk about the Oni is that a few Oni, they are known as Belchers, and they're like this priest-like class, and that particular Oni emit effectively gas, okay, farts and burps, okay, of this odious gas, which creates a haze field which disrupts simplistic electronic systems. So you're talking about like comms and lighting and stuff like that. And so these became a bit like priests, but of course you've got people like this on Oni ships. That starts messing with their capacity to have really, or even just their ability to use a lot of high-tech equipment. And so the Oni just started going for size and mass as sort of a way of solving things. They're big and strong, so rather than making more high-tech weaponry, they just started building bigger weaponry. Okay? Instead of like particularly high-tech sensors and shields and stuff, they just started getting lots of big plates of armor and stuff like that. So a very, very simplistic approach. Okay, so there's like plague-like forces going around. So imagine if the Oni had have hit Haven area during the early days of the Years of Darkness. Like that would have ended lots of the other species. You know, the Corp wouldn't have started because the Vagadi would have been swallowed up. The Remnant possibly also swallowed up. So anyway, and eventually the Oni come across the Twyfar. The Twyfar are journeying out amongst space and exploring things, and the Oni latch onto them in a way and start pursuing them. And the Twyfar don't know how the Oni are doing this, because the Oni are doing this by some unknown means, in that the Oni are just relentlessly following the Twyfar fleets. They try to throw them off, they split up, but no matter what happens, the Oni follow. They keep following. And eventually this just pushes the Twyfar to exhaustion, and they start heading into the inner regions of the old Archon Empire, and they come across Haven. So there's this sense of like ticking until the Oni arrive. And the Oni are traveling in these massive, big gigantic ships called world ships, which are effectively like that's where they put their whole civilization. And when the Oni attack a planet, they drop down, big cargo freights full of slave warriors, and the Belchers cover areas in their like haze fog, and that's how they take stuff. And so one of these world ships has actually turned up in Haven. So it turned up a little while ago, and a combined force of the different species united and attacked the world ship, and they destroyed its engines and crippled it. But this combined force didn't have enough unity to finish the job. And so this world ship's now sitting out there in one of the asteroid belts, slowly repairing itself and slowly sending out the occasional fighter, especially to Mishpasha, where a few have landed and even, started up their own little enclaves, I guess, or tribes or what have you. Yeah, okay, so that's the Oni. The Oni, from a GM perspective, think of them as like the big brutish opponent. Okay, so the different antagonistic NPC factions have a different flavor to them. So feral Nephilim, if you just want a monster of the week sort of thing. Mechanids, great for high tech. Soulless robot type opponent. Echoes, good for ghosts and like ghostly like horror type scenarios. The Oni are good if you want like big boss fights. You could have some younger Oni as well, like a teenage Oni would still be, bigger than a normal legion. And, swarms of mooks of these tortured slaves. And there's another point I might make about the slaves. Like, the slaves are just mentally broken. Like, they're a husk of a person. And it'd be very, very difficult to bring one of them back. I'm not saying you can't do it, but yeah, very difficult. So yeah, you got this sort of chance to explore a really abusive, big, muscly, just simplistic opponent in some ways, but they've got a few tricks. Haze mesh can come through, and sometimes they're so big that you might want to use a couple of NPCs to represent them, like one to represent the arms and one to represent the body and stuff like that. Cool. Okay. Another thing also I will quickly end on before I wrap this video up is that the Oni are also mentioned in Fragged Kingdom. Okay. So in Fragged Kingdom, there's a section that talks about giants. Okay. And I'm just going to read it out to you. This is the single reference to an Oni in Fragged Kingdom. To the west across the Gale Sea, the land's teeming with enormous humanoids. These creatures live a life of turmoil and constant war despite their shared worship of their living god, the four-armed creature known only as Ugrathok the Insatiable. At least, that is the rumor. So the idea is the Fragged Kingdom is like set in the distant future on some remote world where they've technologically devolved, possibly 1,000 years into the future. Okay, so imagine there is an Oni, and this is my idea. If I ever do something with the lands to the west with the giants, and I do Thok, their big four-armed insatiable god, I'm probably gonna do him as like an Oni that is the size of a mountain. Okay, but he's just always hungry, desperate to eat. But he's so big that he can't move anymore, okay? Or he's so lazy because he's been fed so much that his legs are kind of atrophied a bit. And he's just there sitting there, with maybe his back propped up against some sort of ornate carved mountain, with the various giant species of the continent bringing him food constantly to eat in a way to sort of satiate him. But if he ever gets hungry, he'll like move from his position and just go and ravage a land. Okay, so that's my idea for Thok. It's just a rough idea in my head. It's not canon, but that would be pretty fun. And another little moment too. It's also worth mentioning that Oni exist within the Eden Brood Nephilim. Okay, so in Haven on Eden are Oni because they're just part of the ecosystem of what the Nephilim were during the war. But the Devoy Itch is clever enough in that it has realized that it needs to control the Oni because they just keep getting bigger, which is just unmanageable from a resource point of view. And so the Devoy Itch, it has been culling the Oni. But the Oni have really miserable lives in the Eden Brood. They're basically just there to eat and poop out biofuel. And so there's this risk that the Oni could actually rebel. Especially if the Oni Brood turns up to Haven. These Eden Brood Oni might either try and prove themselves to the Devoy Itch and fight alongside to try and, get some sort of rights for them in the Eden Brood, or some of them could actually turn and join the Oni Brood where they would be given status and acceptance and a place. So, yeah, there's a little bit of cultural tension there too. Cool. Okay, hope you guys having a great day, and hope you found this video interesting. I know it was a little bit more rambling, but that's actually a little bit how the Oni are explained. They're not quite so concise. There's bits of information around the place, and I want to encourage GMs to come up with their own ideas and their own cultural quirks to flesh them out. Flesh out their culture a little bit more, and cool, go for it.